Okay, I think we're live. Hello and welcome to those of you who just tuned in for the next hour. Some of you may have just made a last-minute decision to join, and you saw the link pop up on your phone. And some of you, I hope, would have made the conscious decision to join us today because you're embarking on a journey of growth with your organisation, and you're interested in hearing some thought-provoking insights from people who have already been on that journey. My name is Winn, and I'm the head of Global Client Services at Proclinical. And I'm hosting the first of a series of webinars that centers on the theme of expanding your business globally in the life sciences sector. We'll have a session at the end of the month, which is focused on growth in Asia Pacific. And we'll finish up with a webinar in March on growth in the US. But today, as I said, we're looking at the challenges you can face when growing an organization in Europe. And I'm delighted to welcome an inspiring panel of professionals from the biotech industry, who've all been there and done that when it comes to expanding their companies across Europe. We have Evie Baldwin, Director of Talent Acquisition International, and Jarvis, Vice President of Human Resources International, both with Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. Evie and Dawn have overseen the successful and exciting growth of that business over the last few years. And they're joined by Renate, Gloggner, Head of Human Resources for Europe at Global Blood Therapeutics. Renate previously oversaw the expansion of Tesaro prior to the acquisition by GSK, and she's now in the throes of doing it all over again with GBT, who are a biotech business dedicated to developing treatments for sickle cell disease. So welcome to all of you. Just before we start the discussion, I'd like to invite those of you who are watching live just to post any questions that you have for the panel throughout the next hour. And we will do our best to get to those questions towards the end if we have enough time. So without further ado, just to kick things off, Dawn, I'd like to start with you, if I may. And my question to you is, so when you're planning to launch a relatively unknown brand into Europe, how does this affect your HR organization? And how do you begin to organize the company from a strategic perspective in order to achieve your planned goals around external engagement and effective patient reach?
Great, thanks, Neil. I mean, I think as we started at Alnylam, and I think as many companies start as they're expanding into Europe, it's very lean. So you're typically going to have your regional head, maybe legal, maybe finance, and HR. So it's very much around that first piece of planning and cross-functional planning. So I think at this stage you have to have a view of what's going to happen in the next few years, and there are some really fundamentals. So you're working very closely with tax and with legal at a corporate level and locally around what is the corporate structure going to look like, the corporate governance, because that determines the timing and how the different pieces of the business are going to fit together. You're also going to be working with regulatory colleagues because obviously the regulatory process is going to some extent determine the timing of when you want to be preparing for launch and hopefully launch ready. And then you're also working with the whole corporate. If you're talking about a US, which a lot of us start with, a US-led organization that's expanding into Europe, there are things there around to what extent is the region going to be standalone? To what extent are you going to be adopting as far as is possible the US processes and systems, and to that will determine what capabilities you're going to build locally. And so I think the first step is really the importance of this cross-functional planning, because each of those pieces are critical in supply chain quality. Also, as you begin to get those regional capabilities either on board locally or if they do exist in the US parent, once you start bringing those in, then you can really begin to set out your timeline, and all of those things will determine on how you form your organization. So again, you typically start, you're one person, then you got to, you will determine which affiliate countries you're going to be in. And then you sort of need to work with your US parent to say, what of this stuff is going to be provided out of the US and what do I build locally? So it could be compensation. Is that going to be led by a global total rewards? It could be talent acquisition. Is that going to be fundamentally led with a local resource? And then from the business partner and from the HR perspective, how do you want to determine that? And how do you get the expertise in the countries that you're going to need to go in? And you're never going to be in a position to have enough resources up front. So it's really about thinking what is core and critical that I want to have locally, and what do I want to outsource and pull on pull on external partners for. And you're going to be doing this at exactly the same time that all of your other areas of expertise are building. So you won't necessarily know everything up front, and that constant communication between expertise areas is absolutely critical so that you can adjust as you go.
And I suppose there's no exact blueprint every time either, and the disease area that your organization is focused in has an impact on which countries you're going to focus on first of all as well. So you touched upon it there. You've got to kind of feel as you go almost.
Yeah, and indeed the competitive market. If you're into a competitive market and you need a share of voice, then that's going to be very different to if you're into rare ultra orphan, where it's all going to be about education because it's unknown and there isn't a sort of a mapped out landscape already. And that will also determine, particularly for your commercial and medical affairs resources, how the timing you want to bring those on board and the split of those resources.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Dawn. So to bring you into the discussion, Renate, and you mentioned there, Dawn, about vendors and who do you use and what's important to start with. From your perspective, Renate, and actually sort of executing into the region, how do you decide what you do on your own as an organization, and what elements do you use vendors for in the early stages?
Yeah, I think it's a good question and not anything straightforward to answer for most companies. But I think Dawn just outlined a lot of the thoughts that need to happen first. And then sometimes I know that a certain capability is something I want to have in-house, but maybe there's already some need in the markets and I need to do something fairly quickly. And I cannot wait till I have that right capability on board. So there's always a kind of short-term versus mid-term goals, and you would need to carefully consider where do you add or plug somebody in order to get things started and maybe already prepare the path for onboarding the talent who will then come into that position and the person who will lead that role. We also heard from Dawn rightly that there is a lot of specialized expertise around in all kinds of areas. We quickly heard about tax, about legal setups, about contract writings, about the expertise you can leverage in the parent company. But then how do you add the local competencies and the local deeper insights into that? And I think you need to be flexible and nimble, and you need to be open to talk to other companies around yourself and to listen to them, and not to hesitate to take that expert advice on board and to rely on that. And when you think about legal tax support, maybe you want to go with a law firm that can cover different aspects, that can support you with the legal entity built across Europe. Maybe you already work with them in the US, who knows?
Right. I mean, just to sort of educate those that are watching that may be looking to start, to build their organization. Are there particular vendors that you maybe even recommend, or those that you really want to get in touch with straight away that would ease the journey for you?
Yeah, I think there's always a great idea to create some automation and to get some standardized processes in place with early employees as soon as possible. So one of the topics would definitely be payroll outsourcing. There's a couple of vendors like BDO, KPMG, Mazar, etc., who offer these types of services. And so a lot of them can actually also help you with a lot of tax and permanent establishment considerations, etc. We have learned in the past that it is quite good to add up some additional tax expertise, with one of the bigger companies, Ernst & Young, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, BDO, you name them. And usually you have one company helping you as auditor and other companies who really help you to build the structure and to identify all kinds of risks you may encounter along the way.
Excellent, lovely. Thanks, Renate. That's absolutely helpful for the audience, I think, watching from home. Evie, I'm going to bring you into the conversation now. So from a talent acquisition perspective, yep, and building an EU organization, what are the essentials that you need to have in place to ensure a successful TA talent acquisition and attraction strategy when scaling a business in Europe?
Yeah, so this I think links quite nicely to the conversation that Dawn and Renate have just had. There are fundamentally a lot of the basics that you need to have in place. So you need to make sure that you can very quickly establish some standardized processes. Make sure that you've got your legal entities in place for the countries that you want to hire in. If they're not in place, how long is it going to take to get them in place? Are you going to be in a position where you've actually identified a candidate 6 months ahead of having a legal entity in place? It's good to know all of that up front. Are the contract templates there and written? Do they have to be done in multiple languages? Do you have to consider statutory benefits for the countries? And if so, again, what can you realistically establish in the time that you want to bring somebody on board? So all of that is really critical to think about. And again, from a European perspective, notice periods are often much longer than we experience in the US. So it can often be a little bit of a shock to hear that maybe in Germany you might be looking as much as 6 months before somebody could realistically join you. So you constantly having to kind of work backwards from when you actually need that person and when you need to get started hiring them. So across that process, you're going to look at, do you need contingent workforce versus headcount? As Renate said, are there areas where you just want to plug the gap and have somebody come on board very quickly for a short period of time whilst you can get everything set up and established so that you can think about headcount longer term? And then when you're actually approaching people, for me, it's really important to make sure that you are, treating every candidate with the same experience. They all need to have the best experience coming through. So if you've spoken to them, you certainly need to go back to them and speak to them. If you're not going to progress with them, you need to make sure that you've got a consistent process within the business as well. Try and establish up front, what makes an ideal interview panel, who are the key stakeholders that need to be involved. Having 20 people involved in an interview process just because you've got 20 people there doesn't make your decision any easier when you've only got one role. So it's really making sure that you've got the right people around the table at the right time. And making sure that your interviewers are there as your brand ambassadors. If this is the first time you're hiring into the European market, you need people to really sell the organisation for you. They need to have an alignment on the vision and the mission of the company. They need to be telling the same story so that candidates really understand what this potential journey could look like in the short term, but also then the mid to long term as well. Often it can be a bit of a leap of faith for somebody coming into something as a startup. And that's naturally not going to suit everyone. So it's good to kind of really be quite transparent and upfront about what this journey is going to look like. And we often say, we're literally building the plane as we're flying it. And some candidates will kind of express horror at that. Others are all in, and that's exactly what they want to be part of.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, I was going to ask really, and you've kind of answered it there. Transparency is the key, because when you're trying to attract talent, you've highlighted what you need in place to have a good shot at it, but that's not always possible. So you're going to come into challenges when you don't have a benefit structure in place, for instance. What have you seen the impact that has on your approach to the market and attracting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this has been an area of key learning for us as well. Every country in Europe is different. It's not one country. So everybody is governed by different employment laws. Some have collective bargaining agreements that you have to abide by. But essentially, there will always be statutory benefits that you need to have in place in a particular country. You can't access, certain benefit schemes until you hit a certain number of employees in different markets. For some countries, that might be only 2 or 3 people. For other countries, it might be 15 people. So again, you need to really know what that longer term growth plan looks like, so that you can understand what you maybe can and can't offer people. If you're going to look at offering some sort of cash allowance on an interim basis so that people can set up their own private things like medical insurance or pension retirement funds, you need to make sure that again, that's going to be scalable. At the point that you have a company scheme and you remove that cash allowance, is it going to work out for that person? And just be really upfront with the candidate when you're speaking with them. Somebody who's very financially motivated and wants to have the security of a large benefit suite, is perhaps not somebody that's going to be attracted into a startup organization. Somebody who has been in a startup organization before will know that you don't automatically have group pension schemes, company car schemes, for example, all of these nice to haves. But I think as long as you're upfront with people and you have that conversation at each step in the process as well to remind them, then it makes life much easier when you get to offer stage to discuss what you do have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just obviously making me think the importance of the communication between yourself, TA, and you, Dawn, and Renata, running the HR organisation. At this stage, it's kind of critical to have that communication really clear between the organisations. But thanks, Evie. Just moving on, we talked a little bit, each of you, about the US or influence, I guess, and many companies that are expanding into Europe are headquarters out of the US. So how do you, and this will be for you, Dawn, first of all, how do you balance the expectation of an ambitious kind of headquartered company that are maybe out in the US and who want to move really quickly to achieve their goals?
Yeah, no, it's a great consideration, and definitely Alnylam. I think many are US headquarters, and so that is what we experience. And dependent on the maturity of that organization, they can be quite established already if they've done all of their own research and development and have been fairly consistent. You could have 12, 15 years of a sort of growing company that hasn't, previously gone into commercial and certainly hasn't gone into new geographies. So it can be quite a challenge to sort of anticipate what all of those different expectations are. Evie touched on the most obvious one from an HR perspective, which is the notice periods. But I think, again, you see this from absolutely every area of expertise that you work with. I think some of the things around pharmacovigilance and what you have to have in place to be able to market a product in a country, and equally there are different rules and the the qualified person or that you need to have, whether that's again internal or an outsourced person. So each area of expertise has to do this, and so I will repeat the importance of cross-functional planning. So even before you've even started to prepare to actually launch and go to market, having everybody aligned on this so that you're telling a cohesive story in terms of what can be delivered and what is the timing. Again, you start with regulatory, you look at what are the options for early access, compassionate use ahead of having full pricing and reimbursement. And then there's the sort of pricing and reimbursement timelines and the uncertainty of which price you'll actually end up with. So, you can plan to be in a certain market, but if the pricing's not favorable, then you've got a really tough decision to make in terms of, are you actually going to be present in that market, or does that market's low pricing impact the value of your product elsewhere? So because of reference pricing. So I think, the way we approached it is very pragmatic. It was very hands-on. So we basically drew up 3 scenarios. So we drew up that, we knew the plan, we knew the markets we wanted to enter first, we had a timeline, and we basically drew up a scenario that was based on typical algorithms of how long it takes to get to market and to get pricing and reimbursement, and what we could anticipate based on sort of the market data that we could have. We then did a optimistic scenario, which had, some of those decisions being favorable. Alnylam's all about challenge accepted. We have to do everything quicker and faster than anybody else. So we did an optimistic scenario, and then we did a best case scenario, which was when every decision, we got the best possible, timing for regulatory, we got the best possible classification for the benefit of the product, we got the best possible timing for pricing and reimbursement. And so by having those and making it truly cross-functional, supply chain, packaging, all of that is all looped into this, then you're able to sort of really go to the US parent and say, these are the scenarios that we would, this one, safe, it's probably not what you're going to want. This, the middle one, the optimistic one, there's some risk in there that we've balanced, or there's the high risk one, which we can try and go for, but the appreciation is it might not be exactly achievable. And that approach seemed very really good to test understandings and assumptions, and then to get a little bit granular from an HR perspective, things like, how long does it take to get registered for Social Security in Spain? How long does it take to have a bank account up and running? And then as Evie said, if you're planning to launch at a certain point in Germany, for example, you've already got to back off from that in terms of how, when do you want your key account managers on board? When do you want your medical staff on board? And then a 6 months potential notice period time, and then however long you think it's going to take you to go to market and find those. So the importance of the planning and how rigorous you can do that, and being coherent in the story that you can tell. It's no good, commercial saying, well, we can do it in this time and the packaging's not ready. It's just so important that cross-functional discussions are really, really robust. I can't stress how much that was something that really made a difference for us.
And I guess it really only takes a couple of bumps in the road then just to put timelines way back. Did you encounter that while you were building the Alnylam organization that pushed you back further and further than you had anticipated?
We didn't find that we were pushed back, but what we did find is that we hadn't pulled all of those elements together robustly enough. We'd sort of set the overall and then had people go off and start working in their areas. And what we did, we actually invested in a very experienced program manager to come in to work with all of us internally, and to make sure that we could pass the inspections, that we could do what we needed to do. So we didn't miss anything dramatically, but it was quite an aha moment when we realized that we really needed to get some robust structure around doing it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dawn. I mean, in terms of then executing plans, and obviously they change all the time. I can change all the time. Renate, can you give us an example, perhaps, the overall, what the implications of executing plans that you put in place, and then having to change slightly while you're on executing that plan? Can you give some examples, kind of adapting along the way?
Yeah, I mean, there's literally all kinds of things happening along the way, and no matter how many times you would have done it, there's always something new or something you have not anticipated. And that's actually the reason why I can only agree with Dawn to have a good and solid plan to cover most of the things you can anticipate is just really, really crucial. Now, when I worked in former companies, we had a number of things we learned along the way. So at one stage, for example, we realized that our product forecast and the planning of the amount of product we need started to get under pressure, because suddenly a competitor started to run a head-to-head study, and there was much more demand. Also, the early access programs were much more successful than planned. And you need to react to that. You don't want to leave patients behind without medication. You want to make sure that you create the right name in the market and all of that. And sometimes you have it the other way around, right? Sometimes you think, okay, let's make sure we have all the right resources in place in all the core market. And then you find out that timelines in some countries take much longer. So, in hindsight, we may not always have hired the general manager for Italy and Spain together with the general manager of Germany, France, and the UK. And I think these are just new data points which we will consider much more carefully, because quite often you can do a lot of stuff in the markets without bringing people on board, so that you're not losing momentum. And it's a fine line. What's that right timeline, right? It would be nice in hindsight, you're normally better informed than in the moment when you have to take the call. But to collaborate across functions and to constantly reevaluate and to stay agile, I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, and again, the importance of those vendors that you talked early on in gathering as much external intel possible that you can present back to the business to make those decisions is really, really important. And so on the topic of being agile and adjusting your plan, a question perhaps for all of you, but I'm going to start with you, Evie. You've been obviously part of a successful organizational build already, but is there anything that you would do differently if you could start all over again?
Well, this is a really interesting question, because when you are part of something like this, it happens so quickly that often you don't have the time to just stop and reflect back and think, was that the best way to do that? Could we have been slightly more efficient there? And I constantly tell myself, if I do this all over again somewhere else at some point, I will have regular kind of reflection points where I can look back, and also to celebrate the successes that you have had. Because again, particularly within a talent acquisition world, hiring moves so quickly. You can spend months and months and months on a key hire, but the minute they accept the offer, your focus is straight on to the next key hire, and so you don't really get the time to kind of stop and just enjoy the success that you've had. I think one of the key things that I do reflect back on, and that I think is really critical, partly is in relation to this cross-functional communication that we keep talking about. And that's just making sure that your communication with whoever is handling your compensation and total rewards is very, very open, and that you build those relationships very quickly. You know, we're very, very, very fortunate that the team that we have, who are globally based over in the US, they're very experienced and they're very open to having conversations, and you know, you're not going to have salary ranges in place necessarily for every market that you go into. You're more than likely going to be buying in data from external sources, looking at that market data, and it's probably not going to match with the candidates that you've got in front of you, because things move so quickly. And particularly, you know, with a situation like Brexit, for example, that's having quite a big impact now on the type of talent that people are trying to hire in countries like the Netherlands, where historically those people haven't been hired there. So the compensation data isn't there either. So you're almost on the back foot. And again, I think, you know, that definitely is something that maybe I wouldn't necessarily do differently, but I would place a higher emphasis on building those relationships and trying to secure that data on a very regular basis, because the markets do move so quickly.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks, Evie. I can totally appreciate where you're coming from there. In terms of staffing, it never really stops, does it? You don't get a chance to sit back and go, I've done my job now. On to the next challenge. Renate or Dawn, do you have any insights here from your perspective? Anything that you would maybe do differently if you started all over again? I'll go to Dawn first.
Yeah, so I mean, Evie touched on it. I think in terms of the HR perspective, the pieces that were, you know, that you really need to have in place are around compensation and benefits. And when you are from a US parent company, there just isn't the appreciation of the complexity of it, and you know, the importance of, you know, when you set up your entity, if you need a collective bargaining agreement, really thinking about which one you sign up to. You know, what is the appropriate one for your business, and what does that mean for your business, and how do you build that in? So that, I think, is probably the one area that I think caused us the most pain in terms of really getting people to align. And of course, it's very emotive often for candidates, because much as you tell them that it's a different situation if they're coming from a more established organization, because it is their sort of security, their well-being, it's such an important piece of it. And I think if there was one thing I would do differently, it would be really to make sure that we were much more prepared for that. We were into hiring straight away, and you know, as Evie alluded to, you know, it was sort of and by the skin of our teeth, having the legal entity and the documents set up, and we just weren't as prepared as we could, especially when you go into markets, you know, like Belgium, like the Netherlands, where they have so many complex allowances. When you haven't got an HR professional based in each of those markets, or who comes from those markets, who hasn't got that absolute intimacy to it, it's hard to have those good conversations. And just sort of going back to a question you asked earlier, Neil, we did use, because obviously we didn't have people in every market, we did use an HR solutions provider who has just literally been on call for questions from us. So that, I would say, because you don't have the luxury of having someone who's intimate with every market, that I think is you know, another recommendation I would make, you know, for people to think about as they're setting this up.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I mean, perhaps if anybody does have questions after about who those people are or who those companies are, then we'll field those questions and get some answers back. But yeah, that's really useful. Renate, any thoughts from you in terms of maybe doing things slightly differently?
I think when you have the luxury to set something up from scratch, I think it's very important to also think about scalability as soon as possible, so that you're not fixing one-offs. So Evie, for example, referred to the employment templates. That's a simple little thing. But you could just have one drafted for one person, or you could put in extra effort and you could draft a template that actually covers all kinds of aspects which you will encounter along the way. There may be a sign-on, there may be a home office, there may be part-time, there may be all kinds of things, so that you are really thinking ahead and you invest that extra time. It's never a waste of time. It really pays off very quickly, especially because you're going to be very busy and you're going to have to deal with other curveballs. So I think the automation and thinking ahead, that's definitely something that pays off. And if you don't do it enough, it's backfiring. So you always miss it in some places and you always pay the bill for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I've got a few more questions to go. We're doing quite well for time, so hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience, maybe one or two at the end as well. But Evie, so this perhaps you've answered a little bit in some of the questions that I posed, but when entering a new market and again a relatively unknown brand, as you did with Alnylam, how do you ensure that you're attracting the strongest talent in a hugely competitive market? Seems it's getting even more competitive recently, but what would you say?
So I think it very much depends on the market you're going into and the experience that you have in-house within what your TA capability is. If you're just one person, you can't obviously do all things. You can't be all things to all people. So fundamentally you need to look at where do you need to engage external vendors, where do you know that you need specific language capabilities so that you can make sure you've engaged people through the right channels. Again, from the leadership team that you've probably built already, how can you leverage their referral network? Most people will have people that they want to recommend and bring on board in some way, and making sure that everybody's aligned in being that brand ambassador, so everybody understands what the company's goal is, what the mission is. And I think even when you're selecting your external vendors, you want to work with people that also share your values and your goals as well, and they work with the same ethos. I think it's important to really invest that time up front with anybody that you engage externally, so that they also understand that you're on a journey and that you're maybe at the very beginning of that journey, and perhaps what you share with them is what you're looking for today might not end up being the type of person that you end up hiring. So you need somebody that's going to really be prepared to take the bends in the road with you, because without doubt there will always be some. I think again, consistency is really key. Be very consistent with messaging that's going out to the external market. Make sure that anybody that's involved in your process is also being consistent with that message as well, and be authentic. We have many conversations where we can say, listen, we need to be really upfront with you. Yes, you're going to be the person making the most strategic decisions for the commercial organization, but when the doorbell goes at 5 o'clock, you're also suddenly the post person, and you need to deal with what's on the other side of that. And if that's not something that excites you, then that's fine. We wish you all the best, but we need to be open and transparent about what this looks like. And hopefully it's a journey that people want to take with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so importance being on consistency and culture you mentioned there as well, which leads me to another question I'd be keen to hear from everyone. Dawn, I think I'll start with you, but can you talk about some of the challenges you've encountered when trying to build a consistent culture with a company throughout a region that's obviously got a lot of diversity in terms of languages and culture already?
Yeah.
and not just from the start as well. How do you continue to sort of promote positive culture internally and externally?
No, I mean, a really great question, and you know, nice to pick up from where Evie's just been speaking, because you know, the first hires that you make, you really do have to, you know, put your arms around them. They you know, the number of conversations I had, I remember one with a country manager, France, and you know, he says, you know, one minute I'm talking to the Ministry of Health, and then the next minute I'm out to buy the coffee or the new printer, and you really know with those people, those that get it and are going to be in that journey with you, and that is so critical. So as Evie says, the consistency, you know, I'm you know, always very authentic and transparent with people, and certainly, you know, when we're hiring people, we made a point of not painting something that didn't yet exist. We actually sort of were very clear with people. Initially, our interview processes were quite long, and that was partly because we had a lot of US colleagues involved at first. They, for two reasons. One, they were very interested and curious to know how we were building, but also we didn't have enough people in the region to be able to have local panels necessarily. So they were quite long, but a lot of people came back to us and fed back that was actually very useful, because they really did get a sense of who we were and what we were all about. So those first hires are critical, because they are going to form the basis of building that culture in their particular country, in their affiliate, and so we do a lot with those people. We provide a lot of branded gifts. We provide a lot of Alnylam messaging. We do a lot of all company town halls. We have them through COVID, with everyone working remotely. They've been very frequent, and they give a lot of information. They're very transparent to people. We do this through orientation. We give people a lot of information. We're very transparent. We've got with a great pipeline. We work in a rare disease space. It's very patient centric, and by having those core values really front and center of everything we do, that's how you get that culture, because each affiliate will build it slightly differently. What Italy decides to do might be different from what Germany decides to do. And that's right. And it should be, because they have their own personality, but the core is still the same. And so we pull that core together by having, the regional perspective, the global perspective, and these very strong core values, which, they can all be a double-edged sword. One of ours is openness and transparency. That can be a double-edged sword. We're all overloaded with emails because you get so much information, but everyone is able to, really clearly articulate the mission, the vision, and what we're all about. And that transparency is what puts those roots down in the growing affiliates. And that's what, becomes something that continues to knit us together as one organization. And I think the other thing I would say is, if someone does join us and they're not a fit, when you're small, it becomes pretty apparent quickly, and nobody likes to talk about that, but it does. It becomes apparent to the individual. They're frustrated, they don't know why this or that isn't in place, but it becomes apparent to you, and in those situations, again, I think transparency is the watchword, and that's when sometimes you have to find a quick resolution to that.
Yeah, I think that's why you see resilience being a core value a lot in businesses, particularly in a startup, because you do have to, just stick with it, and there's going to be a ton of challenges along the way, but to keep battling through that is worth it, absolutely, sort of in the end. And I think, Renate, are you facing the same sort of challenges and experiences with GBT in terms of building that culture. You're early on there at the moment with the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think don't touch on so many topics Evie already did, so that's really great. In addition to that, I also think you consciously need to work on that culture, and you need to stop to have discussions with the senior leadership team, and it needs to become a practice that you're interested whether the behavior is really acting out in a way or perceived in a way that you communicate it should be perceived as, because you can say and do a lot, but as long as the employees and the external partners are not perceiving it in the same way, there's still work to do. And you can do a lot. And part is communication, part is training, part is just having open conversations, taking the time to stop, and empowering the senior leadership team members to multiply that experience with their own teams when they're building them. And that's really what makes a difference. So it's not a one-time conversation and it's done. It's actually an ongoing process. And when you see it as that, it becomes a really interesting journey. And with highlights and lowlights and new insights, and you grow together, which is great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Renate. Evie, would you? I know you talked a little about this at the beginning, but would you add any more? Because obviously culture is a big part of what you have to talk about when you're attracting talent and you're engaging with new candidates. Anything?
Yeah. I guess my final thought on it would be just to keep the high standards that you have as a company. So make sure that you are engaging people who really believe in the vision and the mission of the company, who are very patient focused. These are really, really unique career opportunities, and they're not going to suit everyone. They are going to be a bit of an emotional roller coaster at times, but I think the reward and the satisfaction that you get from them, it's just not comparable to anything else that you'll experience in your career. And for me personally, all of that ultimately leads to positive patient outcomes. And I think that's what we're all here for.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Really nice comments. Finally, so I have one last question, which I'm going to pass to you, Renate. So you're just in the process of expanding GBT into Europe as we speak. Can you tell us about some of the current challenges? And do you notice we've only mentioned, I think I heard Dawn mention the word COVID once. So it's really nice that we have not just filled this discussion with the challenges that COVID has presented us. But yes, could you kind of discuss, give us some the current challenges you're seeing, any advice around how to navigate any of these effectively?
Yeah, maybe to add something that we have not discussed so much. So I think one part is the plan, and the other part, and to stay agile and nimble, and to be on top of everything. But then, of course, there's also execution. And a lot of people you hire early on are people who can do very strategic work and also hands-on work, because I think Evie, you alluded to it a bit. You also want to leverage people, and you want to make sure that they grow with the company. Now, when you have that wide spectrum, not everybody is fantastic at executing or is a perfect project manager. And at the very beginning, Dawn mentioned at one point that, to bring in somebody who can really help you to get organized and structured, that I think is a very good advice. I think to hold each other accountable, to make transparent what you're working on is really important. And currently there's loads of great tools out there. There's online tools, and you can really put that plan that it is cost into tangible outcomes and deliverables. And you can use that to hold each other honest, to ask questions of each other, to point out that pieces are missing, etc., etc. And I'm talking about tools like Smartsheet, Monday.com, Asana. There's a lot. And of course, they need to fit for you and for your team. But in the end, having a great plan, having the right people and resources, having a great culture, and then being able to execute will really bring you across the finishing line.
Absolutely, yeah. It's bringing it all together is the trick, isn't it? That's the key.
Yes.
Thanks, Renate, and thanks also for mentioning some of the tools that you use out there as well. I think that's certainly going to support and help people that are watching, hopefully. I mean, are there any more thoughts? We've got sort of about 10 minutes left. Any more thoughts on that last kind of question that I just posed to Renate around sort of current challenges and navigating those?
I think maybe I would just say, Evie mentioned it, but really expect the unexpected, because we were started our build pre-Brexit, and some of the functions, some of the build we expected to be UK based. We've moved that, and so it's quite a significant shift for us. So I think that's the other thing, is to just keep thinking and keep looking for those opportunities where you can, you take something that comes along that maybe you hadn't anticipated, but you look at and say, okay, how do we not just react to this, but how do we use this to make our build more robust? How do we leverage this opportunity? We added a hub in Amsterdam, and we've put some certain functionality there that was just a really good opportunity for us to have another hub for talent than we'd originally anticipated. So rather than just reacting and say, we need to do this in the Netherlands or we need to do this somewhere else, it was like, okay, where else could we have somewhere that gives us that opportunity to attract really good regional talent? So I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons, is really just that flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to say, I think we have got one question that's popped up, which is actually from Todd, who works at Proclinical, Todd Wigmore. You'll see it come up against the bottom of the screen there. So for your initial first phases of hiring in Europe, do you have successes in driving referrals from US employees? I think you sort of talked early on about the leadership teams and really driving referrals, but do you have any examples of how the US have really helped to staff the EU organization from the referral process?
I mean, certainly we have had a number of referrals, and we continue to do so. I think in the biotech space in particular, it's quite a small world, even across countries, and so we get referrals literally all over the place. We have referrals from the US when we started to open into Japan. We have referrals from the US into Europe, but we also now have people referring from Europe into some of those other markets as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's really important to sort of drive that early on and continue to sort of drive that initiative throughout the business.
I think one of the the other pieces that this has just prompted for me, but it's related to some of the other stuff we were talking about earlier, is when you're hiring, when you're brand new company, you're hiring from either bigger pharma or from peer biopharma companies. So everyone's coming with different sets of experiences. So going back to what we were saying earlier around building a consistent culture, there is something there in terms of you have to unpick some of that. But also because people are coming from what are fundamentally your peer group companies, there is a great referral network that comes with that, because they obviously know the people from within those companies, and whether they're US and saying about colleagues that they've worked with in Europe, or vice versa, as Evie said, that's the other way that we really find that the referral is a critical piece.
And to add to that, Dawn, I really think a lot of companies underestimate the importance of senior leaders in the company talking to candidates and keeping in contact, because candidates who will not come through or found something else are usually a great source to refer other talents. So,
Absolutely.
you know, it is a time investment, but I do believe that's time very well invested for the future build.
Fully
Excellent.
agree.
I just had another question pop through, actually, which I think is worth highlighting. Thank you. So it's from Maria, also at Proclinical. Hi all, great talk. Which country in Europe has been so far the most difficult in terms of establishing a legal entity and team? Who wants to take that one? They may differ. Each of you may have a different answer.
I just want to say it depends a bit from which perspective you're looking at this, right? I mean, is it establishing a bank account? In some countries, that's very quick. In other countries, it takes forever. Is it establishing a kind of good benefit framework and what you need to do for that? So it really depends what you're looking at. I think it's very important to understand that really all of these countries come with different challenges, and it's never a good idea to assume because people say, oh, we had a really hard time in country X, that it would be similarly difficult for yourself, because it depends a bit on also on the advisors and the timing and you know, sometimes you get lucky with certain things and other companies did not get lucky with the person who supported them from the government side or so. So it's never exactly the same. Yeah, not sure how you experience that, Dawn and Evie.
No, I mean exactly the same. Some countries it took a long while to get the bank accounts and that set up. Other countries, it was more as we started to hire people because the in-country situation was very complex. So you're right, and I would say I wouldn't want to put my finger on one country or another. Some are more flexible than others is probably what I would say. And I think the other thing Evie touched on earlier is you don't always have all of your legal entities set up immediately. So sometimes you have to think about, can you employ out of one country for someone who is fundamentally going to be doing a substantial part of work in another country? And sometimes, if it's a first employee or maybe an only employee, but you want coverage of that other market, you might think to do that.
The other piece I was thinking, so I fully agree with both Renate and Dawn that each country is unique and will present its own challenges at different times. But I think the other piece that we haven't mentioned that certainly has been a big topic for discussion in Alnylam is around language capabilities. So if you're going to be setting up and you're a US parent company, the likelihood is you're not going to be looking to translate every piece of communication that the company has. So you're going to want a certain level of English fluency. And for some markets, that's going to be much more challenging than other markets. And again, in certain job roles, it's going to be much more challenging than it is in other job roles. So that's something I think you need to really establish up front and consider if you're going to have the resource, the funds, the capabilities to provide the translation that would be needed if you don't insist on having a certain level of English. And if you do want to have that level of English, again, you need to make sure that you're aligned across the whole organization. Otherwise, you're continually having discussions about, yes, this person is fantastic talent, but can they really survive within this organization? And, is it fair to they're not going to be set up for success?
I think that, sorry, Neil, I was just going to say that is such an important thing. And when you're in a very, we talked a lot about culture and how you establish and maintain the culture across a diverse region. If you've got people that cannot, have a level of understanding firsthand of the sort of broader interactions, then it's that will make it even more difficult to have that sort of single cultural feel. So I think that's a really great point that Evie's raised.
Yeah, and I'd just like to thank Maria Salvador for that question that sparked some extra really good content, actually, and very important for people to recognize and think, you know, deeply about if they are going to be building a culture, an organization across Europe. So yeah, thank you. That actually brings us really nicely to the end of the session. So I think if anybody watching does have any questions, you know, they come to them after the program finishes, then obviously post those, and we will do our best to kind of get a response back to you somehow. I'm not sure how it works. I'm sure our technical expert Peter Hogg can share something afterwards that helps people to do that. So I'd just like to say thank you, everybody. Evie, thank you very much. Dawn and Renata for taking the time to discuss some of your great experience and your insights today. I do think it's been a really worthwhile session, which I hope will provide some great advice to some of you who've joined this evening, which you can put into practice and, you know, with your own growth plans at the moment. So thanks to you all for joining and watching. Look out for the next sessions. The one on Asia Pacific and the US webinars will be live over the next few weeks. Have a great evening. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.